Welcome to this webinar, and today we will focus on the provision that ESOL and the country need. English to Speakers of Other Languages provision, known as ESOL, aims to develop English language skills of people who were born and raised speaking languages other than English and who are over the age of 16. This is a very, very diverse group with very different cultural, linguistic, educational, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Over the last decade, the ESOL sector has been consistently challenged by increases in demand, cuts in funding, a lack of strategic planning from government, and fragmentation of provision, making it really difficult for many to access the most appropriate ESOL programs and then academic and vocational programs for them. The Bell Foundation commissioned Dr. Philida Schellekens to produce a review of the ESOL qualifications and curriculum with evidence-informed recommendations to improve ESOL standards, qualifications, and methodology. In today's webinar, Philida will introduce the highlights of this new review, which we are launching today. But before I introduce Philida, I just wanted to explain the structure of this webinar. So first of all, I will very briefly introduce the Bell Foundation and its work. Then Philida will summarize the key points of the ESOL Qualifications and Curriculum review. And after that, she will take any questions that you may have. Please note that some participants have already sent questions ahead of the webinar, so these questions will be asked first. Feel free to use the Q&A box to send any questions as they come to you, and I will collect them and post them to Philida during question time. Tomorrow, you will receive an email from us with a link to access the slides and the video recording of this webinar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Philida Schellekens. Philida works as a consultant for the Bell Foundation, among many, many things, and is the author of the Foundation's ESOL Qualifications and Curriculum Review. She is a leading UK and international consultant in the teaching and learning of English as a first, second, and foreign language, with expertise in the inspection and management of 16+ FE educational, vocational, and TVET provision. Philida has worked as a senior advisor on educational reform at ministerial level in several countries, and we're really very, very lucky to have her today. She's a very, very busy lady, so we're really happy to have you, Philida. You will hear from Philida in a minute, but first of all, let me briefly introduce the Bell Foundation and our work. So let me tell you very briefly then that the Bell Foundation is a charity, and that it was set up actually in 2012. And over the past 12 years, we have taught more than 86,000 teachers and have achieved important policy outcomes and become a leading voice on tackling language barriers faced by speakers of English as an additional language. Our vision is to create opportunity, change lives, and overcome disadvantage through language education. To achieve our vision, we work with partners on innovation, training, research, and practical interventions. By generating and applying evidence, we aim to change practice, policy, and systems for children, adults, and communities in the UK disadvantaged through language. So how do we actually do this work? What is our programmatic activity? So at the Bell Foundation, we fulfill our vision and mission through 3 different programs. The first program was, and still is, the EAL program, which started in 2012. And the aim of the English as an additional language program, EAL, is to improve the educational outcomes for children in the UK who speak English as an additional language. So we work here with reception early years, primary and secondary schools mainly and mostly. Also academy trusts, etc. The second program in 2015 was the criminal justice program, and the aim of this program is to break down both the language and cultural barriers to accessing justice and rehabilitation for individuals who speak English as a second language or English as an additional language and who are in contact with the English and Welsh criminal justice systems. And the newest program, and a very exciting one, is our ESOL program, which started as a humble project, a pilot project back in 2020, and is now a full-fledged program. And the aim of the ESOL program is to influence policy and, in doing so, increase opportunities for speakers of English as a second language to access ESOL provision and language support. So it is as part of our ESOL objective around influencing policy and relevant stakeholders that we have commissioned this work and asked our consultant, Dr. Philida Schellekens, to actually conduct this review of qualifications and curriculum. So I've stopped sharing. Over to you, Philida.
Can you all see this?
Perfectly fine, Philida. Thank you.
I'm really glad. Thank you. So welcome to this webinar. It's been great to work with the Bell Foundation and my colleagues on the aspects of ESOL that I'd like to share with you today. And I'd like to start with a little bit of background to the context of the ESOL review. Some of you may know that there were three kind of aspects here, and some of you may know that the first was the outcomes of the DFE below level 2 consultation, which is not the most elegant title, but this was the DFE title that they went and consulted on. And that resulted in some fairly broad recommendations by the current government, I should say, of course, on where the qualification should go for level 2 and below. And the good news is that ESOL is still very much in the framework, which is very good to see. But there were also some recommendations that the standards for literacy and numeracy, and from there the ESOL background documentations would also be looked at. So that was a good driver to start thinking, well, what might the DFE like to consider when you think about delivery on the ground? The second was the Ofqual study that was published at the end of 2022. And that really looked at assessment properties, the comparability between different awarding bodies and the core curriculum using CEFR alignment, which is a really interesting study to do. And in fact, I was on the panel and felt very privileged to be part of the discussions. And that study, I think, really gave sort of background evidence to what I think a lot of us have thought about, particularly exams and the way that the levels are structured, which I'll come to in a minute. And the third is to think about the Skills for Life strategy, because it was launched over 20 years ago. And, you know, the core curriculum came in its wake, really, with the levels and exams following suit from there. And when we look back on it, it really was, you know, designed for that time in education as far as ESOL was concerned, very much thinking about adult learners and to help people find their way using English. We often call it for survival, but day-to-day purposes. The other aspect was that ESOL learning was made to fit, and I was part of the discussion groups at the time, and that's really how it felt to me, and I don't think I was the only one. It was made to fit the adult literacy strategy and standards, and that had advantages in that, you know, we were fully funded and there was lots of activity that we could never have undertaken. But on the ground, from a pedagogical point of view, there have always been questions about how well that would work. And the third reason is that the linguistic framework for language teaching in general is no longer in line with research evidence. And in a way, you know, that's what you would expect. That's not necessarily a negative comment. it's just in 20 years' time, there's been so much more research evidence on, you know, how learners learn adult learners learn languages most effectively. So that's the context to the ESOL review. And before I go into the it's not liking me moving my screen.
Shall I do it for you, Philida? I don't think.
Here we are.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad I managed to fix that. I don't know how, but here we are. So the review process then, I thought you might like an overview, but I know many of you have been involved in the second stage of the work that we've done, but it'd be useful for everybody, I think, to know. So we started off with a review of the Skills for Life instruments, and that includes the ESOL Core Curriculum, the standards, but also, you know, the advice that and the handbooks and things that were published at the time. We looked at research literature, particularly on second language learning, language acquisition, and also published data on adult migrants and refugees. And interestingly enough, I thought I knew quite a lot about the data, but there were bits that I'd never really explored in as much as I've been able to do through the, you know, the opportunity that the Bell Foundation have provided. So that resulted then in a draft evidence base and recommendations. And although we're not going to talk very much about the draft evidence base, it is there. And I know very many people have responded positively and said, yes, you know, this was a fair description of how we are delivering ESOL in the sector, together with recommendations. So then the second stage was that we went to consultation. We had a really rich response with 131 individual and group responses, and some were from whole colleges where people put you know, a single response together, which was incredibly valuable. And I know I've said at the bottom, thank you to all who responded, but I couldn't, you know, say how pleased and grateful we were to receive your thoughts. The other thing that was really good was that we had very high agreement on the need for reform. And you see the numbers on the screen, 85 to 97%. And right at the end of the document that we published, you will find an overview of each of the questions and which ones rated the most highly, which I hope is useful as well. We analysed over 550 comments and had 2 round tables, one with teachers and managers, and then a second one with policymakers, because they have been interested, and we're grateful for their interest and their feedback on the findings that we were coming up with. So the last stage then has been a final report incorporating feedback, which is very useful because it's helped us refine and be clearer about some of our recommendations, but it's also really helped with a steps change in thinking, well, actually, what is the right way of moving forward with the overall framework? And I'll share that with you in a minute. I should also say that amongst the 550 comments were quite a few. There were some real trends where people were raising aspects that really concern them, which are outside the direct scope of this study, because we were looking mostly at, you know, the qualifications and the curriculum, and if you like, the pedagogy and the exams. But it seemed such a good opportunity to summarize those aspects that are to do with funding. You know, you won't be surprised, but also the quality of teaching and learning and other aspects. So we summarized these right at the end. So they are very much on our radar, and I'm sure that policymakers will look as well. So I've selected 5 key areas in the report that I thought might interest you. I haven't gone completely through the report and chosen everything. For example, there is a big section on the use of functional skills English and how appropriate that is for second language speakers. But, you know, that is written up, and there are a few other aspects as well that I hope you'll find interesting. But these are the 5 that really seem to have the most, you know, relevance and interest. And one is really to take, the first one is to take it right back to the essentials. What are our learners' needs and their skills and aspirations? And then key areas for ESOL development, the need for a reference framework, and then data, which the more I think about it, the more passionate I feel we really, really need. And the last is the need for a national strategy for ESOL. So we'll take each in turn, and I hope you like. So the first is, when you look back at the current core curriculum, it's very much to do with language for day-to-day communication. What we're recommending is that there should be an element of language for work and study as well. And that seems to be, you know, absolutely key when you look at what the learners need. This second part, and I've pulled these together, is the need for appropriate advice and guidance. And I think that's where the sector as a whole, I think it's the right time to think about how well we do that, because our learners really are different from first language speakers in their experience of education and employment, and how you get into employment compared to people who are born and went to school here. So the first is to think about learners' existing skills, and that includes language skills. Sometimes I think we spend a lot of time thinking about what learners don't yet know, but it's actually what can they do, as well as their skills in the workplace and their experience and their short and long-term objectives. I see quite a lot of provision where teachers don't yet know what learners did before they came to the UK. And it seems to me that's actually really important to note as we welcome them onto programmes. Then there's also that understanding of cultural differences in study, job search and work. And if you can see me smiling, I wish I'm not the first language speaker, as many of you know. And I could have done with some of that advice, because there are major differences in how you produce work, for written work, for example, for assignments, how you enter into job search and employment. And the last aspect is that planning for progression to next step programs and employment. And I'd really advocate that even, you know, at the beginning, from the start of programs, there are links made to where people might go next and how certain aspects could really help them make that transition to good effect. So the second slide is the need for evidence-based research on language learning. And when I say language learning, I don't just mean ELT in general or ESOL specifically. I mean language learning in general across the board. There is so much research out now that is really evidence-based across a whole range of languages and how they're learnt, that really can inform how we teach and how we help our learners learn in more ways than, you know, I ever thought possible when I first started teaching myself. The second is to work from a true ESOL centered focus. And I know that that's what we try to do, but my major concern is that at the moment we're working with a blend of first and second language speakers criteria. And there is quite a lot of drag from the first language learning criteria into the work that we are supposed to do in terms of the language descriptors that we work with, the exams and the type of questions that people are expected to have to answer. And I think I'd really propose that we should go back to square one and think, what is language learning for adult learners really like? And make sure that, you know, we help learners to learn in the most effective way we can. And the other thing that has really risen to the top because of the Ofqual study on ESOL is the learning loads across ESOL levels. So in particular, when you think if people have no English whatsoever and they can't read and write in their first language, the learning load to get from that really beginning of pre-entry to the end of entry one is phenomenally large. And it was interesting to see that the CFR, when we mapped the skills and the skills development across that it actually went beyond A1. So there really seems to be an issue there. I also think, you know, it became obvious that entry 3 actually has compared to the other levels around it, a very kind of limited learning load. And it seems to me that, you know, if we do want to continue, I wouldn't advocate it, but if we do want to continue sticking with functional skills English, then that jump from entry 3 into level 1 functional skills is even more understandable now that we've seen how, you know, how light comparatively entry 3 is. The other aspect that I can't help but raise is the assessment of listening and speaking as individual skills. I know we talk a lot about spiky profiles, but if ever there is a spiky profile, particularly in the early stages of language learning, it must be speaking and listening. And without listening, you know, it's almost like you haven't got the key to develop the skills that people need so that they can learn to speak, and from there to read and then to write. One or two more areas, and they're not little ones, but when you look back at the core curriculum, in some ways, the development of it was quite typical of its time, in that vocabulary really wasn't mentioned as much as it is now, and the role of vocab together with grammar has been integrated in a much more foregrounded way than the core curriculum did. And it means that our learners really lack an important tool to be able to learn effectively and become fluent and able to express what they really want to say in a positive way. The other one is listening. We tend to take listening as comprehension, and there is that sort of bottom below level stage of development where listening is actually when you hear that stream of sound hitting your ear, is your brain able to cut that stream of sound into meaningful units, quite often words or you know, chunks of words. And that, I think, is one of the most valuable things we can do with our students. And the last is the teaching of English to pre-entry learners. We had a lot of discussion about this during our roundtable with teachers and managers. There is so much research that shows that, from people like William Grabe and others, that learners really need to get a handle on, you know, the way the sounds work in English, the meaning of spoken language, that listening and vocabulary development, as well as speaking and grammar, before they can meaningfully undertake reading and from there writing. And I think it's kind of, in a way, the cause is very likely the introduction of the national literacy standards for first language speakers, which were overlaid onto second language learning needs. And I really recommend that we have another look at that when it comes to the review. And I hope to convince you that this is a really, really important way to help learners make progress more effectively. So these are my kind of key areas when you think about the pedagogical development, how they would fit into the standards development, the regulatory framework. But the question is always why. And for me, one of the key areas is that language learning is time consuming. If we can try and make sure that we make the learning as effective as we can based on research evidence, that people will progress better, they will maintain their motivation. We hear of so many learners, certainly I do, I don't know if you do, where they just lose hope and think, I can never learn this language. And that where they can make the best use of the limited learning time allowed and the government funding. And we know there's not enough learning time. We know there's not enough money to pay for people to make the progress, so they can really feel that they're getting somewhere, and from there get into routes that they really want. So the other reason for going for this is the increased validity, reliability and parity between the awarding body exams. We know from the feedback that we've had that is a really important aspect for you as well. The differences between that have crept into some of the exams and the structures. And ultimately, seeing standards and exams and the framework as an opportunity for positive washback, so that teaching, learning and assessment are more effective. The next slide is on the need for data on the ESOL learners. It's really interesting to think that we have no DFE data beyond the data on adult learners on discrete ESOL provision. And yet we know there are high numbers of ESOL learners in further education and skills. And where are they? They're not just on discrete adult provision. They're on the 16 to 18 learning programs where we have very high levels, in particularly some of the colleges that I've seen. And it's not just vocational training, it's A and T levels as well. And when you think that 20% of school pupils are identified as having EAL, and learners who have the most, the most need for language learning tend to come to FE colleges, that is a very significant number. There's also the fact that 50% of ESOL learners are reported in FE colleges and adult education. And so that goes way beyond the numbers that go to the discrete adult provision. I have not put on the slide, but actually thinking about it, we also see a lot of second language speakers on adult provision who are not actually studying ESOL. So they could be on IT, they could be on childcare courses, and they're not, we have no idea on how many there are. And last but not least, there are many apprenticeships providers who have phenomenally high numbers of ESOL learners. I work as an inspector, and I do quite a few apprenticeship provision inspections, and I've seen 80–90% of learners on some of the provision types, on the standards. So for example, health and social care, but interestingly enough also on management and on catering and areas like that. So the result is that we don't know how many people are second language speakers who need support to thrive on provision. And that's right through the learning cycle, from enrolment into, whether they drop out or are retained, their achievement, or even their progression over time. And really, the Bell Foundation and we really feel that this is absolutely crucial so that we know where learners are. We're able to investigate much more closely how well those programs are doing. And for example, for Ofsted to take a more active interest, because at the moment they have no data either. And to do that, it's still a contentious area, I suppose, but the ILR marker, the individualized learner record marker, is essential. There is, to our knowledge, no other way of actually identifying that. And we're proposing that should be a fairly simple process that gives us, the valuable data that we really need. On to number four then. 3 options for a reference framework. The first is to keep and revise the ESOL core curriculum. I mean, that would maintain the status quo, but actually it is incredibly unorthodox in approach to have the NQF, the National Qualifications Framework, to use a core curriculum as a basis for standards. And really, there are so many limitations to that in terms of how you then derive separate curricula in terms of the needs of the learners. And that is something that we really feel is very important, because if nothing else, it's almost like the core curriculum is kind of fractured, or should fracture, to be able to really design curricula that meet the original target group, who had maybe very low level English skills and who want it for day-to-day living. There is also a need for the 16 to 18-year-olds curricula, which attracts very little interest. And there is also a need for, sorry, let me just, there is a need for if there is a need, sorry, for the revision of the curriculum. It is enormously long at the moment with the language descriptors and the suggested activities. It's hard to see how you could do that with those different target groups in mind. The second is to revise the ESOL exams. And some of the respondents to the questionnaire raised this, and it really made me think, because it, to some extent, on the surface, it looks like that's very attractive and it could be much quicker. But I don't, it's sort of, when you think about the how, I'm not sure that it would be quicker, because the awarding bodies still need a common reference framework from which to develop qualifications. And Ofqual needs that so that it's able to check what the parity of the qualifications is like, and to make sure that the qualifications reflect the requirements and the skills profiles and knowledge and understanding that learners will need for a particular level. And that is crucial, because the Ofqual study found quite clearly that there are disparities between the awarding bodies' qualifications. And in some ways, I think that's very understandable, because the core curriculum, it can't function as a standard. And so that drift over time has become more and more pronounced. Option 3 is to develop standards which are ESOL specific. And that seems the simplest and most logical way to measure language development, in the way that other standards do across the National Qualification Framework, and when you look at other language qualifications. So that would make it much easier for the awarding bodies to really come up with qualifications that have parity, validity, and reliability. So the levels, the appropriateness of the tasks, but also the equivalence between the exams that they all produce. That allows Ofqual to derive and regulate qualifications in a way that's kind of structured. And it allows providers to then construct curricula to meet needs. So you would then it'd be up to the providers to design a curriculum for adult provision, for study programs, and for high needs provision, because I haven't mentioned that, but there are quite a few learners that I see when I inspect high needs provision who also have English as their other language and who also have particular needs. And one of the questions that came in this morning was from someone who asked about, what about refugee teaching, and saying that in many cases the core curriculum at the moment is inappropriate because so many refugees find it really painful to have to answer questions about their family and their family circumstances and who they're living with, which I'm sure we've all seen when we teach learners, who have come with trauma in their, having experienced trauma. And if we have the standards, that would enable providers and teachers and managers to filter in or out activities and contexts that meet those needs and avoid unnecessary heartache. So really try to start off with kind of setting out those 3 different ways of taking the framework for reference forward, and I really have tried to be neutral, and I've consulted extensively with my colleagues at the Bell Foundation as well, but really the simplest, most equitable and language and learning focused way of moving forward is to develop standards which are ESOL and learning specific. And that is a proposal that we're making to the policymakers in DFE and IFATE and Ofqual and all the other organisations that have an interest and have responsibility for deciding on the strategy going forward. And that, is what we suggest. So 2 more slides. The need for a national strategy for ESOL. Well, those of us who've worked within NATECLA in, I think it was 2016, that we produced our first document under the leadership of Jenny Roden, who did a fantastic job pulling that document together. There still is a need for a national strategy for ESOL, if not more so, because our landscape has become even more complicated, if you like. There is IFATE, who now sets the standards for apprenticeships and other technical qualifications. And we have an even wider range of organisations with the most recent editions of the MCAs, the mayoral curriculum. What am I saying? The mayoral
Combined.
Thank you, authorities. Why couldn't I think of that? Thank you. And the need to address the need for teacher training and its quality and range, because, the centres that we used to have for teacher training very often went beyond the local areas that, were sort of delineated in the regions. So what next? Clearly, to keep ESOL learners at the heart of what the Bell Foundation does, continue the work with partners, and you're very much part of this, to promote good practice in teaching, learning and assessment, and to use this review as a live document as a catalyst for thinking, change and improvement. And I think that's me done. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Philida. You can't imagine the activity in the chat, the comments about
Oh, really?
so many about disparities in level, disparities between awarding bodies, issues around, standards and materials and appropriacy of materials. So lots of conversation already happening. So let's move on now on to the Q&A part of the webinar, and there are a few questions here for you. So the first one is from Martha, and she's asking, how were the standards for pre-entry arrived at?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think, well, they were clearly clearly designed to start with, particularly for learners who have learning difficulties, because they, thinking about the drive to have new standards for people whose first language is English. The pre-entry was clearly there for what we now call learners with high needs, so who are in the equivalent to SEND provision for those who work in schools. And of course, Martha Young-Sholton has been one of the driving forces in thinking about the literacy and educational needs of adult learners, because she's done this fantastic project under the LESLA aegis on this work. And she's a very good, and her colleagues are a very good example of how international cooperation across Europe, from covering a range of languages, is really good. And this is another reason why I'd like to sort of raise my hands to the policymakers and say, this really needs looking at, because they're in some ways the most vulnerable learners, and they need to be able to learn effectively. Does that answer your question or Martha's question?
I think so. If I remember right, it was part of the Access for All, wasn't it? A long time ago.
Yeah, I think it was also EU funding that may well be a precursor. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Philida. Second question, this time from Philippa. She's saying, I am interested to know how this government or future governments are going to pick up the recommendations.
I would like to know too. I think there's been a lot of interest in what we've had to say. And I think not least because of the tremendous response we've had to the draft consultation, because it's been a long time since we've had a real open consultation about where we are with ESOL and where we might want to take it next. And so it's really because of many of the people who will be listening in now that you've made it possible to say there is a real voice in the sector that would like to take this forward, because we really want to do the best for our learners.
Thank you. Diana wants to come in. Diana, you should be able to speak now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly fine.
Great. I don't think I can enable my camera though. I think you have to do that. But maybe people don't want to see me.
I think you're okay. I can allow you to talk, but not necessarily to see you.
That's
Diana,
fine.
by the way, for those who don't know, is the director of the Bell Foundation.
Thank you, Silvana. I think a few things to say with regard to an incoming government of whatever political colour. First, there won't be any money. So I think we can be fairly confident that the cuts that we've seen to the adult education budget of 50% over the last 10 to 15 years will not be restored. Secondly, on a more positive note, devolution does present opportunities, and we notice that some of the mayoral combined authorities are, particularly London, interpreting the rules in such a way as to enable greater access. And I think we have one or two representatives of MCAs on the webinar. I think there's been general enthusiasm from some of the people that we've talked to about the need for reform. And I think what has been fantastic, as Philida said, has been the engagement we've had from the sector. So yeah, I think that's all, Silvana, I want to say at this point, but happy to be brought in if on questions that concern public policy or influencing during the webinar, if helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. So a question from Katrin now. She's saying, I'm interested if there's any movement towards a new curriculum and more robust qualifications.
I think it's quite similar to the previous question, isn't it? In that there is interest. I think, you know, it's 20 years since the current sort of set of qualifications and core curriculum were designed. And so I think there's a general agreement that we need reform.
Thank you. Another question, this time from Nigel. How do you assess which level the learners are working?
I think assessment is absolutely crucial to our ability to teach and our learners to learn, because if we can't really assess where the learners are in their development and the progress that they're making, I think I often say it's a bit like throwing mud at the wall. You know, some of it will stick, but not all. And I used to be well, I don't know if I'm still fiery, but I used to say, if you can't assess, you can't teach. And I think it is such a crucial skill to have. And unfortunately, that kind of really looking at what the learners need has become much more difficult to do in this kind of straitjacket that we've been in of working towards those qualifications, when, you know, some of it, as we saw through the off-course study, you really have to think, what is the evidence that this is what learners really need, especially when we have such limited hours?
Thank you. There is a question from by Mary, and she's asking us can you talk us through the difference between a set of ESOL standards and an ESOL curriculum?
I think a set of ESOL standards is the overview of the skills and knowledge that people develop as they're learning English as their other language, whereas a curriculum is what a teacher or maybe a department decides learners need to help that particular group because of their existing language skills and the requirements, but also looking ahead to what they really will need for their next step. So the one is kind of a macro overarching approach, whereas a curriculum is, you know, or should be customized to what those learners need.
So from the standards to the curriculum and to the assessment standards as well, yeah?
Yeah.
It's like the superordinate, if you like.
Yeah, I suppose the assessment is for, if you think in class assessment, that clearly is the ongoing activity of where the learners are, what they can do. If they can't do, maybe what else do they need? It's that kind of constant checking and that enjoyment of watching those learners really develop and improve as they go along, and being pleased themselves, you know, because the job satisfaction is in watching them develop.
Thank you. A question related to assessment, talking about assessment. Fosiya says, is there a recommended initial assessment for ESOL?
Well, there's not one I could recommend. I've seen all sorts, and some of them are published, you know, they're commercially available. And of course, to some extent, the problems that the developers there have is that they're also shackled to the, you know, the ESOL core curriculum and the exams as they've evolved. And that's quite hard. But I think also when you look at assessment, it tends to quite often to be about reading and writing, because, you know, to some extent that's easier to capture and to mark. I see very few notes when I look at, I'd say, initial and diagnostic assessment about what people can do on their speaking and on their speaking skills and what individual help they might need. but also with listening, you know, listening is like a black hole. So yeah, I think it would be really wonderful if we could fix those and strengthen the skills of the teachers to assess.
Thank you. A bit of a long question, so bear with me. Alexander wants to know, or he says, public policy supports the linguistic integration of adult migrant primarily through ESOL provision. Yet 2021 census data on English language proficiency suggests that, particularly in areas such as London, far more people report limited English language proficiency than are or ever could be enrolled in ESOL provision. So how can ESOL providers better support the many adults who would benefit from support but are unlikely to ever enter provision?
It's a really good question, and I'm thinking, what can we do? I think a lot of people opt out, partly because, you know, when you look at the number of men and women who enter ESOL provision, it's, in my experience, anecdotally, about 80-20%. And the big question I always have is, why aren't the men attending? And I think that may be something to do with our curriculum, because it is home and day-to-day life-based. And I don't want to generalize, because actually a lot of women, in my experience in the study that I did in 2001 for the DWP, indicated that women had employment and further study as much at the top of their list as the men. Whether there is anything that we can do outside the classroom, which is, I think, really what Alex is asking. I find that, you know, some people seem to think that people will learn English if they're in an English-speaking environment. In my experience, and if you look at research, it's actually explicit teaching and really helping learners notice how the language works and why, that helps them really improve. And this language by osmosis, it just doesn't work. And if I can give you one personal anecdote, I spent a lot of time in the BSL world, the sign language, British Sign Language world, where people use sign language and really had very low-level English skills. I had to go to CityLit to learn BSL because I could not pick it up from day-to-day communication, apart from saying yes and, you know, my name is and all that. I don't know if this answers Alex's question, but I think more provision is really what we need. And unfortunately, as Diana says, more money may not be forthcoming. So it's a dilemma.
We're moving to the last 2 or 3 questions now,
Sure.
Philida. This is one that's been asked by 2 people, Kathy and Malgorzata. Zata. They're interested in updates on the national curriculum plans for ESOL. Do you know anything?
No, I think that, you know, we know that we've had a really good discussions with individual people within government departments. I think they realise that, you know, there are things that could be done better, but it's such a complicated world, as we know, between, you know, the policymakers who we may be able to influence, the politicians, and then there is the, you know, I don't want to say the Daily Mail because I'm sure they're really lovely Daily Mail readers, but there is that sense that, you know, how well can we prepare people in the local community to see that this is a, you know, a worthwhile cause. And I'm really pleased that, you know, the Bell Foundation has commissioned this, the cost-benefit analysis of providing ESOL, because I think that's the way to win hearts and minds. But, you know, let's say if it takes £5,000 to get people where they can find employment, they come off benefits, you know, they're happier in their lives, they communicate more with people around them in the community and at work. that to me is the best argument we can make. There's one question that I spotted. Can I?
Yeah, please.
It was about have awarding bodies been involved in the consultation? And it's a really good question. They were, they are. They obviously have a really important function to fulfill. And as I think I've made clear, that they're between a rock and a hard place as well, to some extent, or to a large extent, because of the lack of clarity of what the levels really mean. Because the best thing they can work from is the core curriculum at the moment.
One that sounds a little bit not entirely connected, but I think it's really important. I'm sorry, I've forgotten to take the name of the person who asked this question, but the question is around how do we ensure that initial teacher training qualifications for ESOL teaching are fit for purpose?
More money for teacher training would be a good start. I also think that I would like to see more use and more debate about, the evidence that research produces on effective language learning. This is maybe a bit off-piste, but I often see, there have to be proposals for innovative language learning. And my cry is, can we have researched evidence, evidence planning for training of teachers, but also teaching to learners?
And a question from Jenny. Do you agree, it's a little bit long to read, so bear with me. Do you agree that funding really is the elephant in the room? Under Skills for Life, we could really decide how many hours to offer for ESOL, from small, short courses to more intensive ones. We also had a teacher training framework, and in a way, exams were not the most important thing. How can we roll back from being led so much by qualifications and qualification time?
I think is a really good point. I think we're completely shackled to the qualifications, and I have a lot of sympathy with colleagues and with providers where, the penalties if learners don't pass their exams, the financial penalties are just enormous when you look at the baseline of funding. So I think funding is important. And I think we should continue advocating for more funding. But I think there are two sides to the coin, aren't they? One is the funding. The other one is, what do we do with the funding? And I'd like to think that we can be more, well, it will really make me happy if we could sort of review where we are and think of making better use of the little funding that we have, and give our learners the best possible start. And that is, maybe if the qualifications are more fit for purpose, which is what we're advocating after all, then we will get that positive washback into the quality of teaching and learning as well.
Thank you. I'm afraid there is no more time for questions. Thank you so much for a very interesting, fascinating presentation, very lively chat, comments. So a really relevant and important topic that we've been dealing with today. Before we go today, I wanted to remind people of new resources that we will be launching at the Bell Foundation. So do you mind? Oh, I think you can see them now. I'm not quite sure. Lizzie, yes, can they be seen? Can we see the screen?
I believe they can, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so let me just move this slightly to the next. Oops. I'm struggling to, I'm having the same problem as Philida moving this. Do you mind, Lizzie, can you help me move the slides to slide 4, please? Thank you. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to share with you is that we have just published the qualification and curriculum review that Philida was talking about. It's now available to download from the Bell Foundation website. And in a minute, when we can show you the screen, you can see the link. But equally, don't worry, because we will be posting a link in the chat. And tomorrow, we will send you also an email with the links to all the documents. The other important pieces of work that we are launching alongside with this qualification and curriculum review is a project and a material called Voices of ESOL, where we showcase different learners, adult learners, and they talk about the impact that having studied ESOL in college and in different settings has had on their lives and their progression towards, further studies and work. And it's fascinating. I highly recommend you actually have a look at those stories, Voices from ESOL. Again, check our website and we will be sending you the links. And another really important piece is we have a couple of video clips where different people from the ESOL sector make key asks, key recommendations, for changes in policy. So again, you can access those videos through the links that we will be sending you tomorrow. So thank you so much again to you, Philida, for a really interesting, fascinating webinar. And a quick reminder that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to the slides, Philida slides, the video recording on this webinar. And when you leave the webinar, a post-webinar evaluation form will appear. And you will also get a link to that same form in the email tomorrow. We will be really, really grateful if you could spend a few moments to complete it, as your views will shape our future program. Thank you very much to every one of you for taking part in today's webinar, and a special thanks, of course, to Philida for summarizing the ESOL review for us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a lovely evening, and goodbye from all of us here at the Bell Foundation. Thank you.
Bye-bye, and thank you for asking me to do it.
Thank you.